Immanuel Kant was one of the great 18th century philosophers, and he's exactly as smug as he looks, but not entirely without justification, to be fair to him. This Preliminary to Metaphysics was published in 1783 and was an introduction or primer for those who found his critique of pure reason to be too big and hard for them. In this video, we will start to look at the second transcendental problem, which is to ask how pure science is possible as a discipline. If the first problem was to clarify how concepts can create a coherent system, then the second problem addresses how that system can plausibly apply to the world we experience. I am using the Jonathan Bennett translation, and any green text box is my rendering of Kant. Pale yellow boxes are me speaking for myself. The section headings are added by me. They are generally just descriptive, but some license has been taken. Kant says there are two senses of the word nature: the formal interpretation, as in the nature of a thing, its inherent qualities, and the material interpretation, the totality of all objects of possible experience, as in the natural environment and all possible versions thereof. The first interpretation gives us an absolutely cast iron reason to agree with Kant. Totally. If what we call existence it referred to the thing in itself, then we would be unable to know it either a priori or a posteriori. We could not know it a priori because the thing in itself can never be a pure concept. It will by definition contain something separate from a pure concept of the understanding. And we could not know it a posteriori because experience cannot be an adequate demonstration of universal necessary law. Experience can only show what contingently is, not what must necessarily be. But Kant insists we do have a pure natural science to discover a priori laws governing nature. Part of this is what is called general natural science, which consists of mathematics applied to appearance, and also certain conceptual principles which underpin the philosophical grounding of these systems. But Kant admits that it is not strictly pure, because things like motion, impenetrability, and inertia are based on experience inevitably. And they are not strictly general either, because a true general science would apply laws not only to outer objects, i.e. physics, but to inner objects too, which would be psychology, which is something that science still cannot achieve. There are a few universal principles, though. Kant gives such examples as substance is permanent and every event is determined by a cause according to constant laws. So, there is our pure, general, natural science. So how is it possible? Switching now to the material sense of nature, i.e. the world, rather than its system of laws, Kant says that the perceivable world is all we have to concern ourselves with. If we tried to go beyond experience, then anything that we might think about would be supernatural, in other words, beyond nature, and this is not our current concern. The knowledge we are concerned with does precede experience, true, but it can always be confirmed by experience. Once again, I feel like Hume is definitely raising an eyebrow as he is dodging somewhat rather than answering the point. However, Kant does make a good case for the general viability of scientific and rational thinking, in spite of Hume's objections. So the laws of nature never apply a priori to the thing in itself. Rather, they apply a priori to objects of experience. This is why we focus on the material treatment of nature, because it deals with intuitions and, ultimately, appearances. We can frame the problem in two ways. First, we ask, how do we know a priori that experience can conform to law? And secondly, we could ask, how can we know the same a priori of objects of experience, that they conform to these laws? The two questions turn out to be equivalent because the objects are of experience already. There are two ways of stating the claim that we can make from this. Firstly, a judgment of perception cannot be valid unless the judging mind conforms to a maxim that all observed events are connected to earlier events that they lawfully follow. The second way of putting this is to say that everything experienced as happening must be caused. It is obviously tempting to go for two because it is so much simpler. However, we are better to focus on one because the simplicity of two may lead us into thinking that we are dealing with the thing in itself. Kant purports to have shown from this, and the critique of pure reason, that those a priori conditions which we know fit our perceptions must be the same conditions from which all laws of nature are derived, and a judgment of perception which is valid a priori in this way is called a judgment of experience. Although all judgments of experience are empirical, the reverse is not true. All empirical judgments are not judgments of experience. These judgments must incorporate additional a priori concepts. That is to say that judgments of experience are objectively valid. They augment a perception with pure concepts of the understanding. Judgments of perception are only subjectively valid. They only need to hang together in the mind of the subject. All judgments begin as judgments of perception and are later made to refer to an object, becoming valid for all persons. Mind you, the terms hang together and made to refer are doing some f***ing legwork there, aren't they? But remember, this is only a summary of the critique of pure reason. So something's being true of an object is equivalent to its having to be the same for everyone, i.e., objective validity and necessary universal validity stand or fall together. And I will need a summary diagram to say what I think that means. The thing in itself is real, and the organs of sense detect this and deliver sensation to the intuition. The intuition paints appearance, and when focused on, these become perceptions, which can either be judged personally, a judgment of perception, or referred to the understanding for analysis, a judgment of experience. If the general human understanding determines that any person who has perceptions of the kind F will also have perceptions of the kind G, connected in either time or space, then we can validly speak about objects of experience, in spite of the fact that no one has access to the thing in itself. This is provided that we speak only about our experience of the object. These objective judgments are judgments of experience and indicate that perception has married with concept to create a valid causal expectation. This is the mechanism of associations that Kant uses to isolate the thing in itself from our experience. Experience is a product of the senses and the understanding, and so we should discover how they combine. Perception alone is simply a conscious, sensible intuition. Understanding compares and assimilates this perception to either myself in a judgment of perception or consciousness in general in a judgment of experience. The latter is based on the inclusion of a pure a priori concept of the understanding. First, we require a generalized frame of mind which brings something under a causal framework, i.e., makes it subject to a conditional statement. As an example of this, Kant compares the judgment of perception, which is, when the sun shines on a stone, it gets warm, to the judgment of experience, which could be, the sun warms the stone. All objectively valid synthetic judgments must incorporate some pure concept of the understanding. This is even true in pure maths. The concept of the understanding referred to as size is what underpins an axiom such as a straight line is the shortest path between 2 points. We need to list these pure concepts of the understanding, which can also be called categories. To do this, we list all the different types of judgment that one can make, because these judgments each make use of a different pure concept of the understanding. Each of these 4 categories is based on one specific principle, which are, in a sense, the levels of structure in building our model of reality. Intuition, into perception, into experience, and then generalized empirical thinking. As always, debate continues as to whether this structure is correct or complete. In order to grasp all of this together, Kant reminds us that we are not here to consider where experience comes from, but rather what it contains. The former topic is a part of empirical psychology, which is dependent on the latter topic, which is a critique of knowledge itself, especially understanding. Experience combines intuition and judgment, and so cannot be produced by sensory intuition alone. Generality must be added to the specific perception so as to make it universally valid a priori. This comes through the pure concepts of the understanding that distills experience from mere perception. This added element can only be the concept that represents the intuition as a suitable subject for one form of judgment rather than another. In other words, from the list above. The concept is, as it were, the best or only tool available to apply the relevant type of judgment to intuitions of that kind. So to sum up where we are, the business of the senses is to intuit, whereas the business of the understanding is to think, and where it does intuit, it invariably errs. Thinking is the act of unifying representations in a consciousness. This is done in a way that is either 1. Contingent and subjective, or 2. Necessary and objective. And thinking is the same as judging. Obviously. So judgments too can be either subjective in relation to a single consciousness or objective in relation to consciousness in general. This does also show the ease with which one can create a synthesis of terms that appear to cover all eventualities. I haven't read the Critique of Pure Reason, but when you have as many moving parts as Kant is putting into play here, it is almost inevitable that some valid argument is going to exist that ties them all together in a convincing way. In spite of Kant's brilliance, there are soft premises in his arguments that any opponent can simply reject, and many have. In a footnote to this section, Kant discusses the difficulty of experience having an a posteriori component, and he simply uses perception as a proxy. The perception teaches me something, but the concept of causality gets the credit. In other words, the pure concept of understanding is always the essential focus of learning. Judgments, then, are a kind of rule for unifying representations with consciousness. When the judgment presents this as a necessary unity, the rule is a priori, and if such an a priori rule stands on its own, i.e. is not based on something more fundamental, then it is called a principle. Principles are a broad type of judgment which subsume intuitions under the heading of pure understanding. A principle is thus the a priori foundation of possible experience, and the principles of possible experience are the universal laws of nature, as we discussed in section 17. This solves the second problem. Logic enables one and only one set of basic rules, types of judgment. Then, the pure concepts of the understanding that emerge from this are what makes synthetic a priori propositions possible, and this is a transcendental system which grounds a priori knowledge. Lastly, the principle according to which these concepts are applied to all appearances constitute a physical system. This system precedes all empirical knowledge of nature and is what makes such knowledge possible. So, therefore, it can properly be called a universal and pure natural science. Of the four headings in section 21, the first brings all phenomena under the concept of quantity, and also relate that principle to mathematics and experience. The second brings in the empirical through the medium of sensation. It does not subsume sensation under quantity, because sensation is not an intuition that contains time and space, rather it uses time and space. However, because of the nature of the real number line, there is always an infinite gradation from any measurable phenomena to zero. Furthermore, sensation cannot ever prove an absolute darkness on any scale. In other words, it can never prove a zero result. These two facts together allow the understanding to apply the mathematics of quantity from the first principle to even an anticipated sensation, i.e. one that has not come to pass yet. The third of the four headings in section 21 is relation. These are the dynamic relations of temporal existence. Appearances must, in the process of being transmuted by the understanding into experience, be subsumed under first, substance, second, causality, third, two-way causal interaction, and finally, correspondences and connections. But these connections are between the appearance, which is the object of the judgment of experience, and the idea of experience in general. This last point shifts from the third principle of experience to the fourth one on empirical thought. These conditions have to do with A, whether they satisfy formal conditions of the understanding, B, whether they fit with the materials of sensation, and C, that they both bring these concepts together under a single concept. Thus, the nature of judgments of experience is appraised on their possibility, actuality, and necessity according to the universal laws of nature. The table of principles in section 21 has been extracted via the critical method, and it has a completeness that raises it far above every other table that anyone ever did or ever will offer in a vain attempt to extract principles by non-critical methods from things themselves. In other words, Kant has done the best possible job it is possible to do at distilling the pure concepts of the understanding. This claim, however, does rest on his prior assumptions regarding experience and its relationship to the thing in itself, and Kant further assumes that his critical analysis has determined an exhaustive list. As brilliant as this system is, however, in 300 years it has not enabled philosophers to find a science of metaphysics. However, Kant is to some extent aware of this, but continues to insist. My table is complete because all possible judgments that the understanding is capable of have been captured by the critical analysis. This is all possible synthetic a priori propositions. Yet, this table has another, even greater merit, which I will now explain. Kant is intellectually honest and very clear that he wants to speak only in terms of possible experience because his assumptions fail beyond that. He is not, therefore, claiming that the thing in itself has any quantity, degree of actuality, or existence in any substance whatsoever. These three things cannot be proven of the thing in itself because they are synthetic, they associate concepts to each other. But, because of the veil of sensation, they are also purely conceptual, so any proof of them must be analytic, because the basic concepts will be unitary. Kant is somewhat gilding the lily here on what we have seen before. He is driving home this idea that the thing in itself, while somehow relevant to our experience, is not in any way associated with what we say about experience. This separation means that by the time we have come to discuss any ontological question at all, we are already hell and gone from the thing in itself, and any proof regarding the principles and judgments from section 21 must therefore be based on experience and experience alone. He gives a few simplified examples, which we will not oversimplify here, but this clarifies how he will finally answer Hume, which is where we shall pick things up in the next video. I hope you have enjoyed this rather abstract video, and I feel like I've constructed a good narrative. However, please let me know how I did in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.